Welcome to LeaderCast, episode 243. You're listening to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with resources to navigate the challenges and opportunities of courageous, Christ-centered leaders.
When we are at our best as leaders, we are listening at the deepest level.
So before we jump into what that means, let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/243. This is the third in a series on the essential leadership skill of listening. So why are we talking about listening? It seems there's been a continual decline in people's ability, capacity, and desire to listen to one another. So today we want to explore the 3 levels of listening to help you consider if you're listening at the deepest level.
So let's start with a scripture from James, the first chapter, and I'm going to be reading to you from the Message. Post this at all the intersections, dear friends. Lead with your ears. Follow with your tongue. Don't fool yourself into thinking that you are a listener when you are anything but, letting the word go in one ear and out the other. Act on what you hear. Those who hear and don't act are like those who glance in the mirror, walk away, and 2 minutes later have no idea who they are, what they look like. That's James 1:19-24.
So are you going to start preaching, Tim, or do you want to let Peterson's translation stand on its own?
Well, that's a setup because Peterson's translation can stand on its own. But I think one of the things
There's the but.
But one of the things I say every day, Sarah, or pray every day, is help me be quick to listen and slow to speak. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, that is a great reminder to get us started. So to be people who lead with our ears and listen, let's explore the 3 levels of listening leaders can use. The first level, level 1, is what is referred to as me listening. In me listening, we stay focused on ourselves. Even though you are hearing words of another person that you are talking to. Since I've said it in the first 2 episodes of this series, I'll say it in the third. This is where you're formulating responses and not really engaged in what is happening. You're paying attention to your agenda, to how the conversation is impacting you, and often thinking of what you're going to say next when the person finally stops talking. And I mean that finally stops talking. You want them to be quiet so that you can get your words in. Something we don't often consider is if you're being approached to listen to someone, it's okay for them to be focused on themselves. But when you are listening, it's not okay for you as the person listening to be focused on you. Does that make sense, Tim?
It does. I mean, that's the whole part of the relationship, is being able to listen and then respond at appropriate times and not continue to formulate those. It's all about minutes.
Yeah. You heard what I was saying.
I was listening, Sarah. The second level of listening will help you lead with your ears because you're focused on the other person. We refer to this as you listening. Your total awareness is on the person you're talking to. This is the type of active listening many of us learn, where you are reflecting back what you're noticing. And when you're on the receiving end of level 2 listening, it feels like support and understanding. Listen past the words being said and pay attention to the emotions and values and themes being expressed. This level 2, you listening, is a place of deep, intimate connection. Sarah, I've used this type of listening many times when I'm not a counselor and I'm not a therapist, but when I'm listening to somebody who's in distress, just being able to listen and say back to them what they're saying.
Yeah. And it's often in those moments of being able to reflect back that people come to recognize what is actually happening. And they're able to take ownership and take the next step. I think that's why when you said it feels like support and understanding. And one of the things that I've learned about this level of listening is using the same words that people use. Sometimes I think we have a tendency to say back what someone said using a different word, but I'm trying to think of this is a silly example, but let's say you said to me, Sarah, my car wouldn't start this morning. And I say back to you, so you're having trouble with your automobile? That small change, even in the terminology that I'm using, can feel like a disconnect. Because sometimes, now, car and automobile, there's not that much difference. But sometimes the word can mean something different to the person that you're speaking to. I think this one is probably the most familiar to people, level 2 listening. Anything else you want to offer on that one?
No, I think we've said enough.
Okay.
What's the next level?
Level 3 listening is sometimes referred to as 360 listening. This will also help you lead with your ears and your other senses. It's also called environmental listening because some of what you'll do here is really about following your intuition and using your other senses. At this level, you use your senses to notice everything that's happening in the conversation. So you're listening to the background noise, the tenor and tone of someone's voice, and if they sigh or get really loud, and are they really slow in their speech? Or is their level of energy really high and they're talking really fast? What's happening in that space between you and the person that you're talking to? In this level of listening, you're listening for, not just listening to. So it's where you really have to trust your intuition and your gut to say, what am I hearing behind the sigh in your voice? What am I hearing behind you being very careful to choose the words that you're saying? And the other part of this listening is if you then go back to your level 2 listening and reflect back to the person, what your intuition is saying to you, sometimes you're going to be wrong. And that's okay. Let it go. It was just your intuition. Listening at the 3rd level is a place to start with this, is to listen for the inflections in people's voices as well as the emotions. Listen to where the energy is in the person and what choices are being made, and sometimes even where there's resistance.
So, Sarah, what you're saying is the listening we do as leaders is not just remaining silent. It's not being passive. It's not just parroting back or reflective listening. We actually maximize the communication by participating in the conversation and calling people forward and naming what we're noticing.
Yeah, and I think there's a place for everything that you named there in terms of the parroting back and the reflective listening, and also calling people forward and naming what we're noticing. I don't think it's an either or. It's that's part of why I think it takes some intuition, that deep listening is really an art form that grows out of our capacity to be fully present to another person. You may want to listen at the deepest level all the time, but the reality is we're human and we'll likely cycle through levels 1, 2, and 3. But our encouragement to you would be spend most of your time listening at level 2 and level 3. Tim, what questions does that raise for you, or what words of wisdom would you like to offer as we conclude this episode?
Well, Sarah, I'm learning something about myself, which is learner is one of my top 5 strengths, but I'm learning something about myself. I really appreciate being in conversation with people who do deep listening. I can I'm not sure that I'm a deep listener. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't try to or I don't make those connections, but I do understand when somebody's actually listening to me. And what I'm learning about myself is that if I'm not careful, I take advantage of those people. What I'm saying is there is not only a good feeling, but there is a freedom in having somebody really listen. And this environmental listening, as you've talked about it, is bringing that up for me because it means that there's a connection. I use this word in the best sense because we've misused it, but that's the level of intimate listening. Maybe you could even say you're listening not only with your ears, but you listen with your heart. So there's compassion and there's care, but it's not as if you are offering it, you're participating in it, but the deep listening. So it's relational listening. It's what it seems to me.
Yeah. And I think, Tim, you're pointing to the biggest reason that I think we decided to do this series on listening is everyone wants to be heard. And it feels good when we are heard. And we're living in a world right now that's happening, I think, less and less. I think that's unfortunate. And so in those moments that deep listening does happen and someone is hearing the words that we're saying and connecting with us, it's like, oh yeah, finally, someone's listening to what I'm saying. Thank you. And it's like this, there's almost a relief of, I was finally able to say something and have someone hear what was being said. And I just think that in our communities and in the people that we lead and are around the tables that we sit around, that if we can hit that pause button, even for a couple of minutes and do that, what a difference it's going to make in people's lives, in our church, and in the communities that we're a part of. Because people will recognize they have something to contribute and that they are going to be heard.
There's and not to continue to add to what you've said, because I can't add or make it better. What I'm thinking is that there's a validation in that deeper listening. There's a place where people feel like that they aren't just heard, but they're valued. And I think that's what's really missing today in our relationships and the technology and all the stuff. We feel devalued. And that's why we say that, well, when there are problems sometimes in the church, people say, well, there's just no communication. Really what they're saying is, I don't feel valued. I don't feel connected.
And I think part of, as we walked through those 3 levels, part of where I learned this was in the coach training that I received. And so in every coaching session, and just thinking about the last 2 weeks of people that I've spoken with as we're recording this, when I hit the end call button on my phone, 99% of the time, what needed to happen in that moment was they simply needed someone to listen to them. They already had the answer. They already knew what they needed to do. I simply had the privilege of asking a few questions, of listening to what they were saying, and to helping them navigate what their next step was going to be. And so I consider it a privilege to be able to do that deep listening with people. And I think it's becoming something that people desire more and more because it's happening less and less in the natural ebb and flow.
You keep helping me think of things, and I need to think this through more. But I think at this point, I'd say all of us need somebody who listens to us deeply.
Amen.
And We make assumptions that we have some relationships where that happens, or it should happen. And when it doesn't, we need to understand and be clear about what's going on. But all of us need somebody who listens to us closely. And maybe what I would offer to our listeners today who are listening, what I would offer to them is maybe you could be one of those deep listeners for some people around you.
So we hope that this episode helped you to consider the importance of deep listening and gave you a few reminders about the different levels of listening. To find the key ingredients of deep listening, head over to the show notes page at transformingmission.org/podcast, and you're looking for episode 243. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.